Point of View Audio presents Part 4 of The Way It Has to Be, a novella written by Michael E. Hammond. My eyes had been fixed on the ground as we continued to walk through the cold, pale landscape of those frozen meadows. Dead twigs, wind-trampled grass, thorn bushes, pebbles, and large stones hidden partially by the earth and time were all that seemed to pass within my view. The memory of that night was still spinning in my head, the memory of that fire warming me only a little against the wind that only seemed to be growing colder. I told Mrs. Madison the gist of what happened that night. I chose to omit the details of what transpired between Blair and I after the binding spell. She seemed understanding and tolerant enough when it came to the magic side of things, but I wasn't sure how she'd handle the idea of two young men discovering this magic of another kind. Now and again, tiny snowflakes like grains of sawdust passed through the air. It was like a dream, and I felt like we were the only living things left wandering in this world. My eyes remained fixed to the ground as we walked, but I could still feel the shadow growing just ahead. I glanced up, and the horizon was no more. In its place were the towering black trees of the forest. They looked lifeless and forgotten, like narrow creatures reaching up for the sky, strangled by their own tendril-like branches. As we approached the edge of the forest, I gazed within the trees. It was an endless depth where no light from the other side could even be fathomed, guarded by tall blades of wind-beaten grass and wicked-looking thorn bushes that twisted and turned into unpredictable shapes and directions. They were like teeth and claws threatening us to turn back. "How are we going to get in there now?" Mrs. Madison interjected. I was thinking the same thing at first, until I remembered the tiny deer paths that used to run through the forest. "There may be a way in," I said as we walked along the edge of the tree line. Blair and I would often call it the secret entrance, but it was mostly just a footpath made by animals. Did the deer and other forest creatures still wander the woods? There hadn't been so much as a sign of even rabbits in the meadow, but I was holding out hope that not all life had abandoned this strange and forgotten place. Mrs. Madison nodded in interest, and we kept moving along. So much had changed, yet so much had stayed the same. My memory of the path into the woods lingered in my mind like the ghost of a thought. We walked without a word between us until the pasture led into the trees. The pasture was like a grassy cove, the forest like an island, and we were just sailing into the heart, caught by the currents of my own inner tide. Mrs. Madison was moving slower now, taking in each and every bit of scenery around us. To me, this had been nothing in comparison to the lush grassiness that had once been. I mused over the fact that she could seem to see all the beauty in this place, even in its cold and dead-looking state. Soon we were surrounded by trees. Trees to the left, trees to the right, even trees were behind us now as we continued to wander along the winding, frozen, grassy path. The tiny snowflakes continued to fall silently around us as we made our way to where the walls of the trees on all sides finally came together. We were encircled in the grove, trees all around us, yet the sky was still completely visible above. I knew this was the place. The visibly trampled grass led me straight to it, a small footpath on the edge of the woods. It was like a tiny gateway between the trunks of two large trees. Leaves and branches had been flattened, the grass packed down in the frozen dirt. It was obvious that even after all this time, the path was still being used by someone or something. I stood before the opening and a chill came over me. It was a bitter chill that went right into my bones, a chill that felt far colder than the blustering, wintry cold around us. As I stood before the path that led into this forest, I felt the presence of something dark lingering all around me. It was like I was being watched, being lured back into the net of trees. The feeling washed over me like a gust of frozen cold, and as quickly as it came, it was gone. I took a deep breath and put my thoughts aside, and stepped foot between the two trees and into the forest. We walked along the tiny footpath in silence as I took in every inch of the forest around me. One would not believe that it was the same place from the outside. No longer were there threatening, wicked-looking brambles and clawed thorn bushes, not even the overgrown monstrosities of impassable undergrowth. Within, the forest was strangely peaceful and almost welcoming. Soon the path faded away, disappearing into what can only be described as open forest. Trees were all around us, trees of all shapes and sizes, but the need for a path was no longer necessary. You need only pick one direction and then easily walk between the tree trunks. The first thing I really noticed was the overwhelming silence. The birds were not singing. The insects were not chattering. The only sound that could be heard was the crunching of leaves and twigs underfoot. It was not an overly loud sound, but being the only sound, it alone seemed amplified by the silence. We walked for what felt like an eternity before I noticed a scattering of discarded stones. They looked almost out of place, sunken into the soil in what appeared to be a misshapen circle. "I can't believe it." My words seemed to penetrate the silence. "What is it?" Mrs. Madison asked me. By the time she caught up to me, I was already crouching over the rocky formation. "This is where we used to camp," I said, my heart fluttering from this unbelievable discovery. "It's hard to tell from looking at it now, but this was our fire ring." Through time, the ground had shifted and the rocks had moved. It resembled now more a pile of stones than an actual fire ring, but my memories of this place came flooding back to me the moment I saw it all. Instinctively, I began arranging the stones so that it might look more like it once had. Mrs. Madison nodded with a smile when she saw that it was all taking shape. "If only we had some good dry wood and a spark," she said, the trees reflecting in the lenses of her dark glasses. "We'd get a full feel of this nice warm fire." I could see in my mind the flames of all those years ago, burning in the ring of stones. The warm flames of brilliant light, as well as those flames of chilling dark. "A dark fire," I said aloud without realizing it. "What's that, boy?" Mrs. Madison asked. "Sorry," I said, shaking my head. "I was just talking to myself." She mumbled. "This was our campsite all those years ago," I said, feeling the sudden need to explain. "We shared some of the best times here, and unfortunately, it's also where things started to go bad." There had always been a certain appeal to the woods, even before my practice of magic. It was the very essence of nature, the essence of the earth, and, by extension, the perfect place to really fine-tune the balance of mind and body. Perhaps this was the reason I always felt drawn to any patch of trees I could find. It was untouched nature at its core, not to mention the perfect place for a fair amount of privacy. Blair and I had continued to dabble into the art of fire magics as those next few weeks crept on. Between the fair amount of magic we were practicing combined with our newfound interest in more physical side of our friendship, we needed an extra bit of privacy that Blair's room could no longer offer. The air was getting warmer, the land was growing greener, and late spring was transitioning into early summer. That was about the time that we started venturing far out beyond our lookout point and to the woods that sat on the northward horizon. We would often venture into the woods to camp, to explore, and to practice our craft without fear of watchful eyes catching us doing any number of unspeakable things. Within the woods, we were safe. We were free. We were in tune with the 5 elements of nature. The woods was not only our sanctuary, it was our playground as well. One night we were camping in the woods, and I had dozed off for a little while. I remember waking up with that dreamy feeling that comes with still being half asleep. I awoke to the sound of insect chattering and a chorus of night songs. The fire was still crackling within our ring of stones. The air was still filled with the rich, earthy petrichor scent of leafy plants at night. The sweet yet smoky ambery aroma of the dragon's blood incense still trailing in the fragrant air around us. I sat up with bleary eyes and saw Blair poking at the fire with a stick. "Sorry," I apologized, wiping the sleep from my eyes. I didn't mean to fall asleep. He looked up from the fire, his black hair spilling over one eye. You looked so peaceful I didn't want to wake you. He smiled. The night's chill had settled in. The small fire glowing in the ring of stones didn't seem to be enough to warm me. I gazed into the tiny flames dancing amidst the blackened wood and coals, remembering the spell Blair had taught me with the candle. I concentrated on the flames, and with a slight flourish of my hand, the fire began to burn with a bright intensity. Now you're just showing off, Blair laughed, staggering back just a little. But magic can only do so much. I cocked my head, not sure what he meant. The fire that burns twice as bright burns half as long, he said as he stood to his feet. Without more wood, we'll be sitting in the dark in no time. I started to get up. Sit, he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. I'll gather up some more firewood. You stay here and make sure it doesn't burn out. I watched as he disappeared into the darkness of the surrounding trees. At first it was rather peaceful. I sat in my solitude, taking in the tranquility of the forest. As I looked around at the shadowy surroundings, I noticed that our incense were still burning, trailing in thin clouds of fragrant smoke. After a while, each moment felt longer than the last, and Blair still hadn't returned. That is when my mind started to play tricks on me. The simple sound of a snapped twig crackling in the falling distance conjured up images from the Shadow Coven's curse. I felt unsettlingly exposed as I sat in the only light for miles around. That is when I decided to attempt a spell of my own. I reached out with my left hand and touched one of the stones that made up the fire ring. Then, with my right hand, I grabbed the root of a nearby tree. I thought, if I used the combined powers of different elements, I might be able to reach out with my mind and become one with the forest itself. I gazed into the fire and focused my mind. I could feel the heat of the stone, the coolness of the root reaching deep into the earth, and the fire helped amplify my power. To my surprise, the spell actually worked. As I gazed into the flickering flames, I could see Blair. It was not like seeing him standing directly in front of me. It was more like seeing something reflected in a window. The image was there, but it was not overly defined, more like a lingering impression overlaying what was actually in front of me. He was reaching out for a branch that was lying on the ground. I could even see the bundle of branches he had cradled in his other arm. I smiled, my heart pounding at the idea of this new magic I had discovered. As I reached out with my mind, I even knew where he was. Not because I could tell from just seeing, because I couldn't. The vision itself was like a clouded dream. I knew where he was, well, just because I knew. I'm guessing it was because at the time I was connected to the earth. Moments passed and suddenly I could see something else. In that same strange, faint reflection on dark glass-like sight, I saw feet walking on a trail, faces hidden by cloaks, and what looked like knives glimmering in the moonlight. I realized with some strange and haunting fear that we were not alone in this forest. Immediately I let go of the stone and the root to which I was holding. I closed my eyes, trying to shake away the image I had seen. I took several deep breaths until I was mentally back at our campsite. My heart was racing, my body chilled by this cold sweat. I was gazing into the fire, at the red glow of the burning wood, the amber light reflecting on the stones, the fragrant smell of the scented smoke trailing in the air. Blair returned shortly after my strange vision. He dropped a few chunks of wood into the fire before squeezing my shoulder as he had done before he left. "You're soaked," he said. Concern was hanging in his voice. "Are you okay?" I looked up at him, blinking my eyes. "You were gone a long time," I said. I was still trying to fully catch my breath. "I used the stone, the root, and the fire to create a spell, and it worked." "Was it too strong for you?" he asked, kneeling in front of me, cradling my face in his hands. "No," I said. "It actually was a pretty amazing experience. I saw you, Blair. I saw you gathering firewood in my mind, just by tapping into the magic of the forest." "Then what's the problem?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." We aren't alone here, I said. I saw others walking in the woods. It didn't feel right. What did they look like? He asked. I don't know exactly, I said. They were in cloaks and carrying knives. Maybe we should go back to the house, he said. Or maybe we should go check it out, I replied. Somehow I know where they are. I could feel their location in my mind. I explained that they were some distance away, walking along a small path in a ravine in the far northwest corner of the woods. It was a place we hadn't really explored because of the odd placement in the grand scheme of the woods. Technically, I felt like we were safe from them finding us because of the distance and the dark. The truth was, their presence made me uneasy, but I wanted more to test for certain if my vision had been correct. I knew that if we ventured into this northwest ravine and saw them, Blair would see that my spell had actually worked. I crawled off my little patch of warm ground and moved into the cool darkness of the forest. I stumbled blindly through the blackness until my eyes finally began to adjust. It started with the faint outlines of trees and shrubs, each detail of the forest slowly filling in as I could make out the silvery highlights of each tree, bush, and fern, painted in the light of the crescent moon. We walked with a brisk pace, moving steadily to the ravine, and before we knew it, we were nearly there. The closer we got, the slower we moved, each step poised with careful determination. We were silent as foxes as we continued forward. As we moved, I began to notice that just ahead of us, the silvery highlights of the moon were being replaced by a warm and ambery glow. "Get down," Blair said in a hushed whisper, as he lowered himself into a crouch. I followed suit, hunching down and using each tree as a shield as we moved closer and closer to the ravine. Before long, we were actually on the ground, army crawling our way toward the orange glow. I kept looking at the ground, taking special care to avoid thorns and other sharp objects, until at last we reached the precipice. I gazed down from the steep hill into the ravine. The first thing I noticed was the great roaring bonfire in the middle of everything. As my eyes focused on the brightness below, I saw tiny fires dotted throughout the ravine. Torches. They were moving, being carried by people. The same people from my vision. They each wore a dark hooded cloak that concealed their faces. Some distance away from the fire and the people, I could make out what looked like a structure. It appeared to be an old cottage. It was not very big. Its colors were faded, paint stripped to reveal colorless boards. The windows were dark and lifeless voids. I was frozen as I gazed into the depths of this ravine. The fire was too bright, the people too small and far away to really make out what was going on, but I knew in my heart that moving closer was a bad idea. "What is this?" I whispered to Blair, unable to take my eyes away. "I don't know," he replied. "Looks like some kind of cult meeting." I tuned my ears to listen, but couldn't make out any voices, just the faint, crackling snaps of the great fire echoing throughout the forest. Moments later, there were drums pounding without any apparent purpose or rhythm. It was like they were pounding on drums simply for the sake of pounding on drums. On and on they went, hammering out that unsettling sound, a sound that bore no resemblance to any music I'd ever heard. At last, the drumming stopped. That's when I heard the chanting, deep voices chanting in unison, words I couldn't understand. As the chanting continued, I could see the people forming a circle around the great fire. They were dancing and spinning as if possessed, the torches still in their hands. It was a fire dance. I counted 11 torches in all, swinging and dancing around the great fire. It resembled that of a great fiery flower blooming in the darkness. It was a disturbing yet beautiful sight. Abruptly, the dancing stopped, each torch motionless, forming a circle around the fire. The chanting continued as I looked on, and something happened I couldn't then explain. The fire went from a great bright yellow to orange, to red, then to blue. Even the flames of the torches changed colors. As I continued to watch, those flames went from blue to a deep purple, Then, to a point where there was no light at all, just the faint, violet outline that gave only the faintest impression of a fire burning. The valley grew utterly dark, consumed by shadows and that odd violet outline of which can only be called dark fire. I felt a chill run through me, a darkness that I couldn't explain. I knew only that something was terribly wrong. I tapped Blair on the shoulder and motioned to him that it was time to go. I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. The glow of that dark fire reflected an odd purple tint to his shadowy eyes. There was an odd mixture of both peace and anger etched into his face, as if he was in awe of that vision before him and didn't want to be pulled away. "I suggest we move on," I whispered sternly as I tapped on his shoulder again. "If we linger here, they might catch us." "I suppose you're right," he replied. As we turned away, I couldn't help but notice his last lingering glance into the valley. There was a hint of longing trailing in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. We crawled away from the edge of the ravine until we both felt safe enough to stand. By that point, the orange-ambery glow of the normal fire had once again highlighted the trees behind us. Unease still clenching at my stomach, I wanted nothing more than to put as much distance between us and that ravine. We moved with the brisk and steady pace as we had before, until finally reaching the sanctuary of our own dwindling fire. To this day, the image of that dark fire burning deep in the ravine still haunts me. The idea of those cultists and what they were up to still wakes me from my sleep. Of course, at the time we had no idea what was going on, and we had no way of knowing how much things were about to change. "Who were they?" Mrs. Madison asked as we walked along. "We didn't really know at the time," I said. "But, of course, my story isn't over." I could see a smile of excitement stretch across the thin line of her lips. "I assume you met up with them again?" she asked. "You could say that," I said. "I'll get to that part in a little while." "Ah, okay," she said, as if realizing that she was rushing my story along. We walked in the silence through the cold and dreary scenery of the forest. Though the trees we had seen in the other parts of the forest looked dead in the cold and lifeless wintry slumber, these trees truly were dead. Lifeless skeletons, the bark was peeling off some while looking black and charred on others. As we moved through the deadwood forest, the blacker the trees became until some were nothing more than charred remains barely resembling trees at all. Before long, we had arrived at the precipice, the northwest ravine opening up below us. My feet stopped dead in my tracks as I looked onto the valley. It was nothing like I remembered it. The trees were all gone, some little more than blackened stumps nestled in the desolation. My eyes searched the valley below and noticed that the little cottage was gone. In its place was only a foundation of stones and a pit opening up into the ground. Despite the emptiness of the ravine, my eyes gazed onward, penetrating everything in the valley. I could see everything as it had once been. I saw every tree that once stood. I saw the cottage as it had been. I even saw the ring of stones filled with that unsettling fire. I could see it all. "Wow," Miss Madison said in awe. "What happened here?" I didn't reply. I could detect just a hint of disappointment behind the dark lenses of her glasses as she looked at the valley, as if she could feel some tragedy in the wreckage below us. "Let's go down," she said, already starting to make her way down the hill. I didn't move. "This is as far as I dare go," I said. "I've seen all I want to see." "Come on, Ben," she said. "We've come all this way. We might as well go just a little further. You wouldn't want to go and deprive an old woman a chance to really get a good look at this place now, would you?" "I guess not," I surrendered. "There you go," she exclaimed, seeming satisfied. "Now, tell me a little more of your story." We walked down the incline into the ravine as memories came rushing back to me. This was the place where it all happened. This was the place that had literally changed our lives forever. This has been part 4 of the audio recording of The Way It Has to Be. If you have enjoyed what you've heard so far, please consider liking, subscribing, or even commenting, as the story will soon continue in part 5.